well, why are we all sitting here and not somewhere else? We could be sitting in what's today the South Bronx in New York. We could be sitting in Princeton, New Jersey, or Annapolis, or Germantown, Pennsylvania, all of which, along with some 27 or 28 other locations, were proposed as the site of the national capital. But we're here, or at least down the river from the District of Columbia. And the reason ultimately we are here and not someplace else is thanks to George Washington. Okay, I don't want to oversimplify the political combat that took place, and there was a lot. The verbal push and pull and thrashing over the possible site of a national capital. And more than once, that controversy nearly crippled the first Congress. First Congress, by the way, was taking place in New York City, then our capital, 1789 to 91, then it moves to Philadelphia for the rest of the 1790s. But at any rate, so what I'm talking about here is taking place in New York City. And when I mentioned the South Bronx, one of the proposed sites, I will say as a New Yorker and a bit of a chauvinist, it would have been nice, but was the tip of the South Bronx. Anyway, our government, our fragile new government, just about cracked apart over this and other controversial issues that were entangled in a rat's nest of conflict, political conflict. And if anyone has the notion that the early years of Congress and the United States were kind of quiet and driven by consensus and everybody just got along fine and a lot of bear hugs and that sort of, erase it. It was as contentious as Congress today and as government was today. And it was, as I said, this was trench warfare, 18th century style. But at any rate, what was at the nub of the controversy? It had different parts to it, but as has already been mentioned, right at the root was this phenomenon of slavery, of American slavery. There were far fewer enslaved people in the 1780s, 1790s, fewer than 1 million. There would be 4 million by the time of the Civil War, as we know, fewer than 1 million. But it was so deeply entrenched. Every state was a slave state, by the way, except for Massachusetts. Massachusetts, which was sort of pretty much a non-slave state, although we won't get deep in the weeds on that. But every other state knew the number of slaves was increasing in New York in the 1790s, not decreasing. New Jersey had enslaved people, a few, until 1864. Okay, so if you think slavery wasn't a national phenomenon, think again. However, it was the basis of the economy in southern states. And it was made clear, I don't have time to quote as I would like to, more than one member of Congress from a southern slavery-based state saying, we will, if slavery is not protected, we will not remain in this union. Exactly the same threats that would be made later in the 19th century and on the eve of the Civil War are being made in 1789 and 1790 in order to protect slavery against the fear that a national capital in the North, Philadelphia would have been the most likely location, that a capital in the North in a state that was in the process of ending slavery would set freedom as the national standard. It is impossible, at least for me, to imagine, and I think for most historians to imagine, that had the capital been placed in a northern state, that Southerners, slave-owning Southerners, would have succeeded in maintaining their hammerlock on the national government as they did up to the Civil War. So this was an imperative for Southerners. Let's cut to the chase here, or else I'll be here all afternoon. Finally, a deal was cut. Many, or perhaps all of you, have seen Hamilton. You know the deal in the room, you know the room where it happened. There was a real deal, and there was a real room. It was in Thomas Jefferson's rented residence in New York City. And essentially, Alexander Hamilton, who was an emancipationist, I'm not going to say abolitionist because the terms didn't really apply in the 1700s, who wanted a northern capital very much, and was a member of the New York Manumission Society, but desperately needed support to enact a huge and complicated financial plan that would stabilize the finances of the United States, finally was willing to cut a deal with members from the South, brokered by Madison, Jefferson, and a few others, to trade the votes of his northern friends to support a southern capital in a slave state in return for several Potomac Valley congressmen trading their votes for his financial plan to stabilize the country. This was the kind of bargain that politics is made of. You know, politics is not a business for moral purists. But
we try. I mean,
my point is just to underscore again, politics was then and has often been brutal. Principled people making compromises they didn't want to make. Anyway, it had been so controversial just to achieve the idea of a southern capital, safely embedded between the states of Virginia and Maryland. But where? Where? The only person members of Congress trusted to actually select a location was George Washington, who was the great, not just a man, and a guy with the usual array of virtues and flaws of most human beings, but a transcendent symbol of the country's unity in a country that had very little sense of unity. Americans didn't all think of themselves as one people. I mean, even that fraction of white people who could vote. Most couldn't. Anyway, and bear in mind, when I say this was this was a fraught time, that the constitutional system was Plan B. That wasn't Plan A. Plan A was the Articles of Confederation of the 1780s, which flopped. It failed. It was a dud. It didn't work. Right. The constitutional system was essentially a fallback, second best. There was no Plan C. It was either make this work or nothing works. And we go back to being 13 little statelets that don't know whether they belong together or not. So that's what's on the table here.